The smartest person in the room is usually the one nobody bothers to look at. Rain slid slowly down the glass walls of the halcyon room, Manhattan's most exclusive private dining lounge, turning the city lights outside into streaks of gold and silver. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedarwood, expensive wine, and ambition. Crystal glasses clinked softly beneath the warm glow of hanging chandeliers while investors worth billions exchanged quiet conversations over dry-aged steak and market forecasts. At the center of the long marble table sat Nathaniel Reed, 38, founder and CEO of Reed Capital Technologies, the kind of man financial magazines called visionary because they were too intimidated to call him dangerous. His charcoal suit looked perfectly pressed even after 14 hours of negotiations, and the silver watch beneath his cuff cost more than most people's yearly rent. Nathaniel liked control. He liked numbers that behaved exactly as expected, and tonight was supposed to be simple. Convince the investors. Secure the merger. Leave with another headline tomorrow morning. Across the room, Evelyn Carter moved silently between tables carrying a tray of sparkling water. She wore the standard black uniform every server at the halcyon room wore, though somehow on her it looked sharper, cleaner, calmer. Her blonde hair was pinned neatly into a low bun, and her pale blue eyes rarely stayed in one place for long. She noticed everything: the nervous tapping of fingers, the impatience hidden behind expensive smiles, the subtle panic in voices pretending confidence. Most people never noticed her back. That was usually how she preferred it. Slide 18 closes the concern, Nathaniel said confidently as one of his investors questioned the international expansion forecast. He leaned back in his chair, swirling bourbon slowly. The margin correction offsets the exposure risk. Several investors nodded. A few looked relieved. Others simply followed Nathaniel because powerful men often inspired agreement before understanding. Evelyn approached quietly to refill the water glasses. One of the Swiss investors adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the presentation tablet in front of him. "Excuse me," he said carefully. "Your Asian market projections appear unusually aggressive." Nathaniel smiled the way wealthy men smiled when they believed they were still the smartest person in the room. "Aggressive wins markets." A few polite chuckles followed. Evelyn reached toward the edge of the table to place a fresh glass beside Victor Hale, an older investor known for rarely speaking and never wasting words. As she leaned slightly closer, her eyes flickered briefly across the presentation screen. Just one glance. That was all it took. Her hand stopped moving for less than a second. Then she quietly placed the glass down. "Your CFO changed slide 18. The sentence landed softly, almost gently, but the entire table went still. Nathaniel looked up slowly. "Excuse me." Evelyn straightened. Calm. Expressionless. The timestamp in the lower corner doesn't match the formatting sequence from the previous slides. One investor frowned immediately and looked closer. Another adjusted his tablet. Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly. "And you know this because?" His tone remained controlled, but there was something colder underneath now. The beginning of embarrassment. Evelyn glanced toward the screen again. "Because the font kerning changed between revisions. Whoever edited it used a different export setting." Silence. Somewhere behind the bar, ice dropped into a glass with a sharp crack. Victor Hale stopped cutting his steak. Nathaniel gave a quiet laugh, though it carried no warmth. Interesting observation from a waitress. A few people smiled nervously. Others avoided eye contact completely. Evelyn nodded once. Probably nothing. She turned slightly, prepared to leave. But Nathaniel wasn't about to let the moment disappear. Not in front of investors. Not in front of men who measured weakness in milliseconds. "No," he said smoothly, setting down his bourbon. "Stay." The room became quieter somehow. Even the pianist near the entrance seemed farther away now. Nathaniel folded his hands together. "You seem unusually interested in corporate forecasting models." Evelyn stood beside the table holding the silver tray against her waist. "Not interested, sir. Just observant." That answer earned another small laugh from the investors, though this time the laughter sounded less certain. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. "Then maybe you can explain to the table what exactly you think is wrong with slide 18. Evelyn didn't move. Her expression never changed. "I didn't say it was wrong. But you implied it." "No," she said quietly. "I implied it was altered." One investor looked sharply toward the CFO, sitting near the end of the table. The man immediately reached for his wine glass. Nathaniel noticed. So did Victor Hale. For the first time that evening, tension slipped into the room like cold air beneath a locked door. Nathaniel smiled again, though thinner now. All right, he said. Let's hear it. Evelyn remained still for a moment. Then she slowly reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a black pen. Not dramatically, not confidently, calmly, like someone who already knew where this conversation was going. Outside, thunder rolled softly above Manhattan. Inside, 14 investors watched a waitress walk toward the presentation screen, while one of the most powerful CEOs in New York suddenly realized he no longer controlled the room. The soft glow of the presentation screen reflected across crystal glasses and polished silverware as Evelyn Carter stepped toward the wall display, with the black pen still resting lightly between her fingers. Nobody spoke. The investors watched her with the cautious curiosity wealthy men reserved for moments they could not immediately control. Nathaniel Reed remained seated at the center of the table, though his posture had changed almost imperceptibly. Less relaxed now, less certain. The confidence was still there, but something colder had replaced the amusement in his eyes. Evelyn stopped beside the screen and glanced once at slide 18. International growth projections. Southeast Asian expansion. 48-month profitability forecast. Numbers designed to impress people quickly. Numbers meant to move millions of dollars before anyone looked too carefully. You noticed all that from one glance? Nathaniel asked. His voice sounded calm, but only because powerful men practice calmness like an art form. Evelyn nodded once. Patterns are difficult to ignore after you notice them. One of the investors leaned forward slightly. What patterns exactly? Evelyn looked toward the older man who had spoken. The export alignment changed between slides 17 and 18. The margins shifted by 0.3 inches. The timestamp says the file was modified at 6:42 tonight. She paused briefly, but the dinner began at 6. A subtle tension moved across the table. The CFO near the far end adjusted his tie again. Too quickly this time. Nathaniel noticed that too. Evelyn reached for the digital presentation remote beside the screen. May I? Nathaniel held her gaze for 2 long seconds before giving a slight nod. Go ahead. She pressed the remote once. The previous slide appeared. Market stability projections. Same formatting. Same branding. Same polished presentation style. Evelyn pressed again. Slide 18 returned. See the spacing beneath the revenue columns? She asked quietly. It was compressed manually. One investor narrowed his eyes. Another removed his glasses completely. Nathaniel stood slowly from his chair now, bourbon untouched beside him. You are telling me someone edited the projections after the presentation was finalized? Evelyn did not answer immediately. She never rushed her words. I am saying someone wanted this version seen tonight. The pianist near the entrance stopped playing altogether. Even the waitstaff in the distance had begun moving more carefully, sensing something shifting beneath the polished surface of the room. Victor Hale finally spoke for the first time in nearly 20 minutes. His voice was low and measured. And what exactly changed? Evelyn looked back toward the screen. The original valuation assumptions likely showed weaker overseas margins. Nathaniel folded his arms. Likely. Evelyn nodded. The growth curve is too smooth. A younger investor frowned. Too smooth. She pointed gently toward the graph. Real markets do not move like this. There are always irregularities. Supply chain instability, currency pressure, labor fluctuations. This projection removes friction entirely. The younger man slowly leaned back in his chair. Nathaniel stared at the graph longer now. Really stared at it. Not as a CEO presenting confidence. As a man searching for cracks. Evelyn continued quietly. Someone cleaned the numbers. The CFO gave a short laugh that sounded forced even to himself. This is absurd. We are really taking financial criticism from a server? Evelyn looked toward him calmly. No anger. No embarrassment. Just stillness. No, she said softly. You are taking it from the math. Silence again. Sharp this time. Nathaniel walked toward the screen slowly, his expensive shoes muted against the dark hardwood floor. He studied the projection lines carefully. The corrected percentages. The altered export settings. Small details. Tiny details. The kind most people never noticed because they never expected dishonesty inside rooms this expensive. Open the original file, Victor Hale said quietly. The CFO blinked once. It is the original. Then open the metadata. The room shifted immediately. Several investors exchanged looks now. No smiles left. No casual conversation. Just quiet calculation. Nathaniel turned his head toward his CFO. Open it. The man hesitated for half a second too long. That was enough. Evelyn stepped slightly away from the screen, lowering the pen back toward her apron pocket. She looked as though she wanted to disappear again, like someone who regretted being noticed at all. Nathaniel watched her carefully now, not as a waitress, not as entertainment, as a variable he had failed to account for. The CFO finally approached the screen and connected his tablet with visibly trembling fingers. The investors remained silent as the metadata window opened. Modified, 6:42 p.m. User access, D. Whitmore. Nathaniel's expression hardened instantly. Not dramatically, quietly, dangerously quietly. Daniel Whitmore swallowed hard beside the screen. Nathaniel, I can explain. You altered investor projections 30 minutes before the meeting? Nathaniel asked. His voice barely rose above a whisper. Somehow that made the room colder. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. The revisions stabilized concerns. We needed investor confidence tonight. Victor Hale stared at him without expression. Confidence built on manipulated numbers is called something else. Daniel opened his mouth again, but Nathaniel lifted one hand slightly. The gesture stopped him immediately. Evelyn lowered her eyes toward the marble floor as though none of this belonged to her anymore. Yet every person in the room kept looking at her. Nathaniel slowly turned toward Evelyn. Who are you? He asked quietly. Outside, rain tapped softly against the towering windows overlooking Manhattan. Inside, Evelyn Carter held the silver tray against her black uniform and answered with the same calmness she had carried all evening. Just someone who pays attention. No one touched their food after that. The expensive steaks cooled beneath the golden lights while rain continued sliding down the towering windows overlooking Manhattan. Daniel Whitmore stood frozen near the presentation screen, his face pale beneath the soft glow of the projector. The metadata remained visible for everyone to see. 6:42 p.m. Modified by D. Whitmore. No explanation could erase that now. Nathaniel Reed remained perfectly still near the head of the table, though the silence around him had changed shape entirely. Earlier that evening, the room had revolved around his confidence. Now it revolved around uncertainty. And uncertainty was the one thing investors hated more than failure. Victor Hale slowly folded his napkin beside his untouched plate. How much was altered? He asked quietly. Daniel swallowed hard. The projections were adjusted conservatively. Evelyn stood several feet away holding the silver tray against her waist. Calm. Invisible again if people allowed it. But nobody in the room could stop looking at her now. Nathaniel's eyes never left Daniel. Conservatively, he repeated softly. You inflated overseas performance by nearly 12%. Daniel shifted nervously, only to stabilize negotiations tonight. One of the younger investors let out a quiet breath. That is not stabilization. That is manipulation. Another investor reached toward his tablet, reviewing the financial breakdown independently now. Nathaniel finally looked toward Evelyn again. How did you spot it that quickly? Her expression remained unreadable. Because real analysts leave fingerprints when they panic. Daniel's face tightened immediately. Nathaniel noticed that too. Everything felt sharper now. Every movement. Every hesitation. The illusion of polished control had cracked open, and suddenly everybody in the room was studying each other differently. Victor Hale leaned back slowly in his chair. You keep saying things that sound very specific for someone serving sparkling water. Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly. Observation is part of the job. Nathaniel gave the faintest shake of his head. No, not this kind. Outside, thunder rolled faintly above the city skyline. The restaurant lights flickered once before stabilizing again. Somewhere near the back hallway, dishes clinked softly as the kitchen staff pretended not to listen. Daniel finally straightened his tie and forced a controlled breath. Nathaniel, we can still recover this evening if we redirect attention toward the domestic expansion strategy. Nathaniel turned slowly toward him. You are worried about the evening? His voice stayed calm, quiet enough that everyone leaned in slightly just to hear him. You altered investor documents without authorization. Daniel tried to speak again, but Nathaniel raised his hand once more. Silence. Immediate silence. Then Nathaniel looked back toward Evelyn. What else did you notice? Several investors exchanged glances instantly. Evelyn hesitated for the first time all night. Not out of fear, more like reluctance. Sir, she said carefully, I do not think this is my place. Victor Hale gave a faint smile. I believe it became your place the moment you saved several $billion from walking blindly into bad numbers. Nathaniel nodded once. Answer the question. Evelyn glanced toward the screen again. Her blue eyes moved slowly across the data projections. The Asian growth forecast assumes labor stability through Q4. She pointed gently toward the lower chart. But shipping indexes from Singapore dropped nearly 8% last month. One investor frowned immediately. Another pulled out his phone to verify it. Evelyn continued quietly. The labor assumptions also ignore new regulatory delays announced 2 weeks ago. Nathaniel's expression sharpened. Those regulations were not public. Evelyn met his eyes calmly. No, but the procurement slowdown was. Silence again. Heavy now? One investor whispered under his breath. Jesus Christ. Daniel looked increasingly uncomfortable. Nathaniel, this is becoming ridiculous. We are restructuring an entire meeting around comments from a waitress. No, Victor Hale said softly. We are restructuring it around competence. Daniel's jaw tightened. Nathaniel walked slowly back toward his chair, but did not sit down. Who trained you? He asked Evelyn. Nobody. That is impossible. Evelyn remained still for a moment. Then she answered quietly. Some people learn because they are curious. Other people learn because they have to survive. The words settled heavily over the room. No arrogance. No performance. Just truth spoken softly enough that it forced everyone to listen harder. Nathaniel studied her carefully now. Really studied her. The calm posture. The controlled breathing. The way she spoke about billion-dollar valuation models like someone discussing weather patterns. Nothing about her felt accidental anymore. Victor Hale lifted his wine glass slightly. You ever work in finance? Evelyn looked down briefly at the polished marble floor. A long time ago. Nathaniel immediately caught the wording. Not never. A long time ago. Where? He asked. She did not answer right away. Daniel shifted uncomfortably again near the screen while several investors continued reviewing the revised numbers independently. The atmosphere had changed completely now. Nobody cared about dinner anymore. Nobody cared about status. Truth had entered the room, and truth made expensive people nervous. Evelyn finally spoke. Chicago. Nathaniel narrowed his eyes slightly. Doing what? She gave the smallest shrug. Mostly forensic analysis. The room went still all over again. Victor Hale slowly lowered his wine glass. One investor blinked twice. Another leaned back heavily in his chair. Nathaniel stared at her in complete silence for several seconds. Then he asked the question nobody else in the room understood yet. What happened? Evelyn looked toward the rain sliding down the windows. Manhattan glowed beyond the glass like another world entirely. Her voice became softer now. I stopped liking what powerful people do with numbers. And for the first time that evening, Nathaniel Reed had no response. Rain continued falling over Manhattan like silver threads against the dark glass skyline, while tension settled deeper into the halcyon room. Nobody asked for dessert. Nobody reached for another drink. The meeting that had started as a celebration now felt like an interrogation without raised voices. Daniel Whitmore sat rigidly near the end of the marble table, staring down at his untouched bourbon as if the amber liquid might somehow rescue him. Across from him, investors quietly reviewed updated numbers on their tablets, their expressions tightening more with every passing minute. Nathaniel Reed remained standing near the presentation screen, one hand resting against the back of his chair. The polished confidence that usually surrounded him had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. Earlier that evening, he looked like a man certain of victory. Now he looked like a man recalculating reality in real time. And somehow, the only person in the room who still seemed calm was the waitress holding a silver tray beside the wall. Evelyn Carter kept her eyes lowered slightly, avoiding attention even after becoming the center of it. The strange thing was not her intelligence anymore. It was her complete lack of interest in proving it. Victor Hale watched her quietly for several moments before speaking again. Forensic analysis, he repeated slowly. That is not exactly an ordinary career path. Evelyn gave a faint nod. Neither is private equity. A few investors exchanged glances. One of them almost smiled before catching himself. Nathaniel noticed every reaction now, every shift in tone, every subtle movement. He stepped closer toward the table again. Which firm? Evelyn hesitated. Just briefly. Brenner and Cole. The silence afterward felt immediate. Heavy. One investor looked up sharply from his tablet. Another whispered under his breath. Brenner and Cole was not just another consulting firm. It was one of the most feared forensic accounting groups in the country. The kind hired when billion-dollar corporations suspected fraud inside their own executive floors. Victor Hale slowly leaned back in his chair. You worked for Brenner and Cole? Evelyn nodded once. Daniel Whitmore finally looked up again, disbelief visible across his face. That is impossible. Evelyn looked toward him calmly. Why? Because people do not leave Brenner and Cole to serve drinks in Manhattan. Her expression never changed. Some do. Nathaniel studied her carefully. How long were you there? 3 years. Doing what exactly? Evelyn glanced briefly toward the rain outside, mostly identifying financial inconsistencies before federal audits found them. Nobody spoke after that. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled softly across the city. The sound barely reached the restaurant, muted behind layers of glass and money. Nathaniel slowly loosened the cuff of his suit jacket, though his eyes never left Evelyn. You could have exposed Daniel the second you walked in. Probably. But you waited. She nodded faintly. Because accusing people publicly without certainty destroys trust. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. And yet here we are. Evelyn finally looked directly at him for the first time in several minutes. No, she said softly. We are here because you altered investor data. The words landed quietly, but nobody at the table could deny them now. Nathaniel walked back toward the presentation screen and stared at the manipulated forecast projections again. He suddenly noticed details he had overlooked earlier. Tiny irregularities, smooth percentages, unrealistic growth pacing. The frightening part was not that Daniel had manipulated the numbers. The frightening part was how easily Nathaniel himself almost accepted them. Victor Hale folded his hands together. There is something I do not understand. Evelyn turned slightly toward him. What is that? Why are you here? He gestured gently toward the restaurant around them. A woman with your background could work anywhere on Wall Street. Evelyn's fingers tightened slightly around the silver tray, though her voice stayed calm. Not after the Lawson case. Several investors frowned immediately. Nathaniel narrowed his eyes. Lawson Biotech. Evelyn nodded once. Victor Hale's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. You were involved in that investigation? I found the discrepancies. Another silence. Different this time. Less skeptical now. More respectful. Everyone in finance remembered Lawson Biotech. 3 years earlier, the company collapsed after a massive accounting scandal erased nearly $6 billion from the market overnight. Pension funds vanished. Executives resigned. Headlines consumed the financial world for months. Nathaniel stared at Evelyn carefully now. You were the analyst who uncovered it. She lowered her eyes again. Partially. Daniel Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in his seat. That investigation destroyed dozens of careers. Evelyn looked toward him calmly. The fraud destroyed them first. Nobody argued with that. The room had become so quiet now that the soft tapping of rain against the windows sounded almost loud. Nathaniel finally sat down again, slower this time. Thoughtful. Human. For the first time all evening, he looked less like a billionaire CEO and more like a man realizing how fragile power could become when truth entered the room. He studied Evelyn for another long moment before speaking softly. Why leave after exposing something that important? Evelyn's gaze drifted briefly toward the city lights outside. Her answer came quietly. Because after a while, you realize powerful people do not hate corruption nearly as much as they hate the people who uncover it. Victor Hale lowered his eyes slightly at that. Several investors avoided looking at each other completely. Nathaniel said nothing. But inside the heavy silence of the halcyon room, something had shifted again. Earlier that evening, Nathaniel Reed challenged a waitress because he thought power belonged to whoever controlled the table. Now he was beginning to understand something far more dangerous. Sometimes the quietest person in the room was also the only honest one. The atmosphere inside the halcyon room no longer resembled a business dinner. It felt more like a courtroom where nobody wanted to speak first. Rain pressed softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows while Manhattan shimmered beyond the glass in blurred gold and white lights. The investors had stopped pretending this was a routine negotiation nearly 20 minutes ago. Tablets remained open across the marble table, displaying revised projections, procurement delays, and shipping reports that suddenly looked far more dangerous than they had earlier that evening. Daniel Whitmore sat rigidly in silence now, his confidence draining slowly with every passing second. Across from him, Nathaniel Reed leaned back in his chair with both hands folded together beneath his chin. Calm, but not relaxed. His sharp gray eyes moved occasionally between the manipulated reports and Evelyn Carter, standing quietly near the edge of the room. It unsettled him how naturally she carried silence. Most people became nervous under attention. Evelyn seemed almost uncomfortable with it. Victor Hale glanced toward Nathaniel carefully. You realize this merger cannot move forward tonight. Nathaniel gave a slow nod. I know. The older investor lowered his wine glass gently onto the table. And you understand why. Yes. Nathaniel's voice stayed low, controlled, but beneath it was something unfamiliar. Humility. Daniel finally looked up again. Nathaniel, delaying the deal now could destabilize market confidence by morning. Nathaniel turned toward him slowly. You already destabilized it. No anger. No raised voice. Somehow that made the words heavier. Daniel looked away immediately. Across the room, Evelyn adjusted the folded napkin beneath a water pitcher simply to give her hands something to do. She hated this part. The aftermath. The moment powerful people stopped feeling untouchable. It was always the same. First came confidence. Then denial. Then fear. She had seen it too many times before. Victor Hale noticed her expression. You knew this would happen the second you saw the slide, did not you? Evelyn hesitated briefly before answering. I suspected. Nathaniel looked toward her again. And yet you still said something. Because investors deserve accurate numbers. One of the younger men at the table gave a faint, humorless laugh. That sentence alone could get you fired from half of Wall Street. Evelyn almost smiled. Almost. That is partly why I left. Silence returned again. Softer now. Less hostile. More thoughtful. Nathaniel slowly loosened his tie for the first time all evening. The movement seemed strangely human coming from a man so carefully composed. Tell me something honestly, he said quietly. Evelyn looked toward him. All right. If you had stayed in finance, where would you be now? She considered the question for several seconds while thunder rolled faintly outside. Probably miserable. A few investors exchanged surprised looks. Nathaniel tilted his head slightly. You walked away from one of the most elite forensic firms in the country because you were miserable. Evelyn looked toward the rain sliding down the windows. I walked away because after a while, every room started feeling the same. Victor Hale folded his hands together. Meaning, powerful people convincing themselves numbers matter more than consequences. The words settled quietly across the room. Nobody interrupted her this time. Evelyn continued softly. At first you think you are helping companies stay honest. Then eventually you realize most people only want honesty when it protects profit. Nathaniel lowered his eyes briefly toward the polished table. Somewhere inside those words, he recognized himself. And that realization unsettled him more than the manipulated projections ever could. One investor quietly closed his tablet. Another leaned back heavily in his chair, as if exhausted by the entire evening. The tension had changed now. Earlier, everyone feared financial collapse. Now something stranger filled the room. Reflection. Nathaniel looked toward Daniel again. How long? Daniel swallowed hard. 3 months. 3 months, Nathaniel repeated quietly. You altered projections for 3 months without telling me. Daniel rubbed his forehead. I thought I was protecting the company. Evelyn spoke before Nathaniel could answer. People usually do terrible things for very reasonable-sounding reasons. Daniel looked sharply toward her. Easy for you to judge from the sidelines. Evelyn met his gaze calmly. No. Easy because I used to sit at tables like this. Silence again. Nathaniel stared at her carefully. Every answer she gave seemed to reveal less and more at the same time. She never bragged. Never defended herself. Never tried to dominate the conversation. And somehow that made everyone listen harder. Victor Hale finally spoke again. What made you leave New York finance completely? Evelyn's fingers tightened slightly around the silver tray. Just enough for Nathaniel to notice. My father. The room became still. Her voice softened almost imperceptibly. He worked 30 years for an investment firm in Chicago. Trusted the wrong people. Lost everything after an executive fraud scandal collapsed the company pension system. One investor slowly lowered his eyes. Evelyn continued quietly. He spent the last 2 years of his life believing numbers mattered more than people because that was what men in expensive suits taught him. Nathaniel felt something cold settle in his chest. Outside, lightning flickered silently behind the skyline. "I am sorry," he said before he could stop himself. Evelyn looked slightly surprised by the sincerity in his voice. Then she gave the smallest nod. "Thank you." The room fell quiet again. Not uncomfortable this time. Human. For the first time all evening, nobody seemed concerned about stock prices or market headlines or billion-dollar negotiations. Instead, 14 investors sat beneath golden chandelier light listening to a waitress speak more honestly than most executives ever had. And Nathaniel Reed slowly realized the woman he publicly challenged earlier that night was becoming the only person in the room whose judgment he actually trusted. By 10:45, the storm above Manhattan had grown heavier. Rain hammered softly against the towering windows of the halcyon room, while distant thunder rolled between the skyscrapers like a warning no one inside could ignore. Most of the restaurant had emptied by now. The usual late-night conversations of hedge fund managers and celebrities had faded into quiet background noise somewhere beyond the private dining area. But inside Nathaniel Reed's investor suite, nobody seemed interested in leaving. The merger discussion had completely collapsed. What remained was something far stranger. 14 investors sitting in silence while a waitress quietly dismantled the illusion of control surrounding one of the most powerful companies in New York. Daniel Whitmore finally stood from his chair, smoothing the front of his suit jacket with visibly trembling hands. "Nathaniel," he said carefully, "we need to discuss this privately." Nathaniel remained seated at the center of the marble table, staring at the revised projections still glowing on the presentation screen. "No," he said quietly. Daniel blinked once. "This affects shareholder confidence. You altered financial models for 3 months." Nathaniel slowly lifted his eyes toward him. "We are far beyond private conversations." The words landed heavily. Across the room, Evelyn Carter quietly gathered empty glasses from the far sideboard, moving with the same calm precision she had carried all evening. She never inserted herself into the conversation unless someone directly asked her something. Yet somehow the entire room revolved around her now. Victor Hale watched Nathaniel carefully. "What are you going to do?" Nathaniel leaned back slightly in his chair. Earlier that evening, he looked untouchable. Now he looked tired. Not physically, morally. Like someone realizing success had slowly surrounded him with people who protected profit more carefully than truth. "First," Nathaniel said quietly, "the merger is suspended indefinitely." Several investors immediately exchanged looks. One nodded slowly in relief. Another exhaled under his breath like a man who had been holding tension in his chest for an hour. Daniel's face tightened instantly. "You cannot announce that tonight." Nathaniel looked toward him without expression. "Watch me." Silence again, sharp enough to cut through the soft jazz music drifting faintly from the restaurant below. Daniel stepped closer toward the table. "If this deal collapses tomorrow morning, Reed Capital loses nearly $800 million in projected expansion." Nathaniel did not even blink. "Then we lose it honestly." The room went completely still after that. Evelyn paused briefly while adjusting a water glass near the far counter. Not because the statement surprised her, because sincerity sounded unusual coming from men like Nathaniel Reed. Victor Hale slowly smiled into his whiskey glass. "There it is." Nathaniel frowned slightly. "What?" "Your company." Victor looked around the room calmly. "Not the projections. Not the merger. That." He gestured subtly toward Nathaniel. "That sentence." Nathaniel looked away toward the rain-covered skyline outside. Somewhere deep down, he understood exactly what Victor meant. Reed Capital had been built on aggressive strategy, relentless expansion, and impossible expectations. But somewhere along the way, Nathaniel stopped noticing the difference between confidence and performance, between leadership and ego. Evelyn quietly approached the table again, carrying fresh coffee. The scent of dark roast drifted gently through the room as she placed a cup beside Victor Hale first, then the remaining investors. When she reached Nathaniel, he looked up at her for a brief moment before speaking. "Do you think I missed this because I trusted the wrong people?" Evelyn carefully placed the coffee cup beside him. "No," Nathaniel frowned slightly. "Then why?" She met his eyes calmly. "Because successful people eventually become insulated from honesty." Nobody spoke. Even Daniel Whitmore remained silent now. Evelyn continued softly. "The more powerful someone becomes, the less often people risk disappointing them." Nathaniel stared down at the coffee beside his hand. Steam curled upward slowly beneath the chandelier light. And eventually, Evelyn said quietly, they stop hearing truth unless it embarrasses them publicly. The sentence settled over the room like cold air. Nathaniel gave a faint, humorless laugh under his breath. That sounds very specific. Evelyn almost smiled. It usually is. Victor Hale watched the exchange carefully now, his sharp, older eyes moving between them. You know, he said thoughtfully, most people would have used tonight differently. Nathaniel glanced toward him. Victor nodded subtly toward Evelyn. Someone else would have turned this into leverage. A consulting contract. A negotiation. A moment. Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly while collecting an empty wine glass. I am not interested in moments. No, Victor said softly. You seem interested in consequences. Nathaniel slowly leaned back in his chair again, studying Evelyn more carefully than before. The strange part was no longer her intelligence. It was her complete absence of ambition. Every executive Nathaniel knew would have used tonight to climb higher, to negotiate power, to secure influence. Evelyn Carter looked like she wanted nothing except for the truth to stay intact once it entered the room. And somehow, that made her the strongest person there. Daniel finally cleared his throat. Nathaniel, I understand I made mistakes. Nathaniel looked toward him calmly. You made choices. Daniel swallowed hard. What happens now? Nathaniel glanced briefly toward the rain outside before answering. Tomorrow morning, the board receives full disclosure. Daniel's face lost what little color remained. You would destroy your own stock value? Nathaniel's expression hardened slightly. No, he looked directly at him now. I would rather damage valuation than integrity. Evelyn looked at Nathaniel carefully after he said that. Really carefully. For the first time all evening, something shifted faintly in her expression. Not trust. Not yet. But perhaps the smallest possibility that he meant it. Outside, lightning flickered silently across the Manhattan skyline, while inside the halcyon room, the billionaire CEO who began the evening trying to humiliate a waitress slowly realized she had forced him to become a better man in front of everyone who mattered most. The storm finally began to weaken a little after midnight, though rain still traced silver lines across the glass walls of the halcyon room. Manhattan below looked quieter now, softer. Most of the investors had left nearly 30 minutes earlier after Nathaniel Reed formally suspended the merger discussions and promised full disclosure to the board before market open. They left differently than they arrived, less confident, more thoughtful. Several of them shook Evelyn Carter's hand before departing. One quietly thanked her. Another asked for her card, only for Evelyn to politely explain she did not have one. That answer seemed to surprise them more than anything else all evening. Now only 4 people remained inside the private dining suite. Nathaniel, Victor Hale, Daniel Whitmore, and Evelyn quietly clearing empty coffee cups from the marble table beneath the dim chandelier light. Daniel stood near the doorway gathering his belongings with mechanical movements, unable to fully hide the collapse in his posture. Nathaniel watched him silently for several moments before speaking. Human Resources will contact you tomorrow morning. Daniel nodded faintly. I understand. Nathaniel looked down briefly at the untouched merger documents still scattered across the table. Do you? Daniel hesitated. I thought if the deal closed first, we could fix the projections later. Evelyn stopped moving for half a second. Nathaniel noticed. That sentence, he said quietly, is exactly how corruption starts. Daniel lowered his eyes. For the first time that evening, there was no defense left in him, just exhaustion. Victor Hale slowly stood from his chair, buttoning his dark overcoat with calm precision. Most financial disasters begin with temporary compromises, he said softly. People rarely wake up planning to become dishonest. Daniel gave a faint, bitter smile. That does not make the outcome any better. No, Victor replied. But understanding why it happens matters. Daniel nodded once before quietly leaving the room. The heavy door closed behind him with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have been. Silence settled again. Different now. Cleaner somehow. Nathaniel slowly exhaled and loosened the top button of his dress shirt. The image of the untouchable billionaire CEO had faded hour by hour throughout the night until only the man underneath remained. Tired eyes, sleeves slightly wrinkled. A face carrying the weight of realizing success had blinded him to people he should never have trusted. Evelyn quietly stacked the final coffee cup onto her silver tray. You should go home, Nathaniel said suddenly. She looked up slightly. I still have closing duties. At midnight. The city does not stop running because investors panic. Victor Hale let out a soft laugh beneath his breath. I like her. Nathaniel almost smiled for the first time all evening. Almost. Evelyn walked toward the sideboard and carefully placed the empty dishes down one by one. The small sounds of porcelain against marble echoed gently through the quiet room. Nathaniel watched her for several moments before finally speaking again. Why did you really leave Chicago? Evelyn paused slightly, but did not turn around immediately. I answered that already. No, Nathaniel said softly. You explained the scandal, not the leaving. Rain tapped quietly against the windows again. Evelyn remained still for several seconds before finally facing him. After the Lawson investigation, every firm in New York wanted to hire me. Victor Hale slowly sat back down instead of leaving. Nathaniel listened carefully. But Evelyn folded her hands loosely in front of her apron. One of the executives from Lawson killed himself 2 days after the report became public. Silence. Nathaniel lowered his eyes briefly. Evelyn's voice stayed calm, though softer now. He had 2 daughters. Victor Hale removed his glasses slowly. You blamed yourself. Evelyn gave the faintest shake of her head. No, I blamed the system that teaches people their value disappears the moment they fail financially. Nathaniel looked at her carefully. That still was not your fault. Evelyn smiled sadly. Rationally? No. She glanced briefly toward the dark skyline outside. Emotionally, things are rarely rational. The room fell quiet again. Somewhere below on the street, a distant taxi horn echoed faintly through the rain. Nathaniel leaned back slowly in his chair. So you disappeared. I stepped away. There is a difference? Evelyn nodded once. Disappearing means you are hiding from the world. Her pale blue eyes met his calmly. I was hiding from what the world turns people into. Nathaniel felt those words settle heavily somewhere deep inside his chest. Because part of him understood exactly what she meant. The endless pressure. The obsession with valuation. The quiet erosion of humanity inside rooms built entirely around winning. Victor Hale finally stood again, slipping his gloves back on. You know, he said thoughtfully, I have spent 40 years around billionaires. Nathaniel glanced toward him. Victor smiled faintly. Most of them believe intelligence sounds loud. His eyes shifted toward Evelyn. But real intelligence usually speaks softly enough that people have to earn hearing it. Evelyn lowered her gaze slightly, uncomfortable with praise. Nathaniel noticed that too. Victor moved toward the exit but paused beside Nathaniel first. Do not waste this evening, he said quietly. Nathaniel frowned slightly. Meaning? Victor glanced once toward Evelyn before answering. You spent years building a company. He gave a faint smile. Tonight a waitress showed you how to build character. Then he walked out into the hallway, leaving Nathaniel and Evelyn alone beneath the golden chandelier light, while rain continued falling softly over Manhattan. The restaurant had almost completely emptied by the time Victor Hale disappeared into the private elevator downstairs. Midnight rain continued washing softly across the Manhattan skyline, while distant reflections shimmered through the towering windows of the halcyon room. Somewhere far below, traffic lights changed across what streets no one inside could hear anymore. The city kept moving. It always did. Inside the private dining suite, silence settled gently between Nathaniel Reed and Evelyn Carter. Not awkward silence. Careful silence. The kind that existed when 2 people were both trying to understand how an ordinary evening had turned into something neither of them expected. Evelyn returned to gathering the remaining folders scattered across the marble table, while Nathaniel slowly loosened the cuffs of his dress shirt. Without the investors around him, he looked different now. Less polished. More honest somehow. The expensive suit still fit perfectly. The Swiss watch still caught the chandelier light every time he moved. But the performance was gone. You do not have to clean this alone, he said quietly. Evelyn glanced toward him with faint surprise. I work here. Nathaniel stood from his chair. And I made the mess. Before she could answer, he reached for the empty glasses near his side of the table and began stacking them carefully. The movement looked strangely unfamiliar on him, like a man learning something simple for the first time. Evelyn watched him for a second before speaking. Most CEOs would have already blamed someone else by now. Nathaniel gave a faint smile without looking up. Most CEOs probably would not survive being publicly corrected by a waitress. You survived. Barely. The smallest trace of amusement touched Evelyn's expression. Nathaniel noticed immediately. It was the first genuine smile he had seen from her all evening, and somehow it mattered more than the billion-dollar merger now sitting abandoned on the table beside them. Outside, lightning flickered faintly above the skyline before fading back into rain. Nathaniel carried the empty glasses toward the service counter while Evelyn folded the remaining presentation papers into neat stacks. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly after a moment. "You have been asking me things all night." "Fair point." He set the glasses down carefully. "Why stay here?" Evelyn frowned slightly. "At the restaurant." Nathaniel leaned lightly against the marble counter. "Someone with your experience could rebuild a career in 6 months." Evelyn looked toward the city lights outside the windows. "That depends on your definition of rebuilding." Nathaniel waited. She rarely answered quickly, and he was beginning to understand that was part of her strength. She thought before speaking because words mattered to her. "After Chicago," Evelyn said softly, "I spent almost a year interviewing in New York." She adjusted the folded napkin in her hands absent-mindedly. Every firm wanted the loss analyst. Every executive said the same thing. Nathaniel watched her carefully. "Which was?" She smiled faintly without humor. "We value integrity here." The rain outside intensified briefly against the glass. Evelyn lowered her eyes. "Then eventually they would ask how aggressively I could protect a client before reporting discrepancies." Nathaniel's expression tightened slightly, meaning they wanted ethics with conditions. "Exactly." Silence again. Nathaniel understood that world better than he wanted to admit. The language of controlled morality. Honesty that only mattered when it remained profitable. He had spent years inside it without fully noticing what it was turning people into. Evelyn placed the final stack of papers neatly beside the projector screen. "Working here is simpler." Nathaniel frowned slightly. "Simpler?" "People tell you exactly who they are when they think you are beneath them." The sentence landed quietly between them. Nathaniel looked away for a moment because part of him knew she meant him too. Earlier that evening, he challenged her publicly because somewhere deep down he assumed intelligence belonged to people with expensive offices and private elevators. Evelyn walked toward the service tray near the doorway and carefully lifted it into her arms. "Tonight included?" Nathaniel asked softly. She paused. "Especially tonight." The honesty of the answer should have stung more than it did. Instead, Nathaniel nodded slowly. "You are right." Evelyn looked genuinely surprised by that. Most powerful men defended themselves automatically. Nathaniel noticed the surprise in her eyes and almost laughed at himself. "I embarrassed you because I thought being challenged in front of investors made me look weak." He met her gaze calmly now. "The truth is, I was already weak if my ego could not handle being corrected." Evelyn remained quiet. Nathaniel continued softly. "You exposed manipulated numbers in front of 14 investors, and somehow I still thought the problem was my embarrassment." Rain slid slowly down the windows behind him while the chandelier lights reflected softly across the marble walls. Evelyn finally set the tray back down beside the doorway. "Most people do not realize when pride becomes fear." Nathaniel gave a faint nod. "You noticed immediately." "That used to be my job." Silence settled once more. Softer now. Warmer somehow. Nathaniel studied her carefully across the dim golden light of the nearly empty room. "You know what bothers me most?" Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "What?" He let out a slow breath. "The smartest person in the room tonight was carrying coffee instead of sitting at the table." Evelyn looked down briefly, almost uncomfortable with the compliment. "Intelligence is not rare," she said quietly. "Humility is." Nathaniel stared at her for several seconds after that. Because somewhere between the rain outside, the abandoned merger documents, and the silence of the empty restaurant, he realized something unexpected. Evelyn Carter was not impressive because she was brilliant. She was impressive because she never needed anyone to know she was. 3 weeks later, Manhattan woke beneath a pale winter sunrise and headlines that still had not stopped talking about Reed Capital. Financial networks called it one of the most unusual corporate reversals in recent years. Analysts debated Nathaniel Reed's decision to suspend the merger voluntarily and disclose internal manipulation before regulators forced him to. Some investors called it reckless. Others called it leadership. For the first time in years, Nathaniel found himself strangely uninterested in which version people chose. The truth had already cost him nearly $900 million in valuation declines. But it had also exposed something far more valuable than market confidence: It had exposed the kind of man he had quietly become. Reed Capital survived. The board supported his transparency. Daniel Whitmore resigned officially 2 days after the investor dinner. The market stabilized slower than expected, but it stabilized honestly. Nathaniel spent most of those 3 weeks inside conference rooms filled with lawyers, auditors, and exhausted executives rebuilding systems that should have never been ignored in the first place. Yet somehow, despite billion-dollar problems surrounding him every day, his mind kept returning to one quiet image. A waitress beneath chandelier light, holding a silver tray, while speaking more honestly than anyone else in the room. Outside, snow drifted softly across Fifth Avenue as Nathaniel stepped from the back of his black sedan, carrying 2 coffee cups in gloved hands. The cold air bit sharply against his face, but he barely noticed. Across the street stood St. Catherine Medical Center, its windows glowing warm against the gray December morning. Nathaniel glanced once at the small folded paper in his coat pocket before crossing carefully through the slush-covered sidewalk. He felt strangely nervous. Not the controlled pressure of negotiations or investor calls. Something simpler. Human. Earlier that week, one of the restaurant managers at the Halcyon Room had reluctantly mentioned Evelyn volunteered at St. Catherine every Thursday morning before her evening shifts. Nathaniel almost did not come. Almost convinced himself it would be inappropriate. But some part of him understood this was not about business anymore. It was about gratitude. The hospital lobby smelled faintly of coffee, antiseptic, and winter coats dampened by snow. Nurses moved briskly through the hallways while visitors sat quietly beneath soft television light in the waiting area. Nathaniel walked slowly toward the volunteer desk near the pediatric wing until he finally saw her. Evelyn Carter sat beside an elderly woman near the window, helping her fold paper snowflakes for a holiday decoration project. No makeup, no polished restaurant uniform, just a cream-colored sweater beneath a dark coat, and that same calm presence he remembered from the investor dinner. The elderly woman laughed softly as Evelyn adjusted one of the paper folds. Nathaniel stopped walking for a moment, because she looked exactly the same outside the restaurant as she had inside it. Gentle, attentive, completely uninterested in performing importance. Evelyn noticed him several seconds later. Surprise flickered briefly across her face as she stood slowly from her chair. Mr. Reed, Nathaniel held up one of the coffee cups awkwardly. I was hoping you might accept a peace offering. Evelyn looked at the cup, then back at him. You tracked down my volunteer schedule? Nathaniel winced slightly. That sounded less alarming in my head. To his relief, the corner of her mouth lifted faintly. What are you doing here? Trying to say thank you properly. She studied him quietly for a moment before nodding toward the hallway near the windows. Walk with me. They moved slowly through the corridor while soft snowfall drifted outside beyond the glass. Hospital staff passed occasionally, but nobody recognized Nathaniel Reed here. And for once, he was grateful for that. Evelyn accepted the coffee cup carefully. You did not need to come all the way here. Nathaniel glanced toward her. Yes, I did. She looked down at the warm cup between her hands. Most executives would have forgotten me after the crisis passed. Most executives probably would not have admitted the crisis publicly. Evelyn gave a small nod. Fair point. They continued walking quietly for a few moments. The silence between them no longer felt guarded now. Just thoughtful. Nathaniel finally spoke again. I spent years believing intelligence was the thing that built successful companies. Evelyn looked toward him calmly. And now? Snow swirled softly outside the hospital windows, while distant sirens echoed somewhere far down the avenue. Nathaniel let out a slow breath. Now I think character matters more. Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly toward the coffee cup, warming her hands. Character is more expensive. Nathaniel smiled faintly. I noticed. They reached the end of the corridor where morning light spilled softly across the polished floor. Evelyn turned slightly toward him. So what happens now? Nathaniel reached into his coat pocket and removed the folded paper carefully. I brought you something. She hesitated before taking it. Inside was a simple offer letter from Reed Capital. No executive title. No dramatic salary package. Just one line typed neatly beneath the company logo. Independent ethics and transparency advisor. Flexible terms. Full autonomy. Evelyn looked up at him immediately. Nathaniel shook his head softly before she could speak. No pressure. No tests. No games. His gray eyes met hers honestly. I just think every powerful company needs at least one person willing to tell the truth when everyone else gets comfortable. Evelyn stared at the paper quietly for several seconds while snow continued falling beyond the windows. Then finally, very softly, she smiled. And somehow, that felt more valuable to Nathaniel Reed than every investor approval he had ever spent his life chasing.